Let's run a few numbers on a few big Space Marine tank killers. Gladiator Lancer, Ballistus Dreadnought, Repulsor Executioner, or Predator Annihilator, which does best in game? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines once more, and in this video I thought it could be fun to take a look at the damage output of a few Space Marine tank destroying units, some of the big guns that can deal with enemy armoured targets at long range. Definitely something that's handy to have in your army in 10th edition, given plenty of dangerous vehicles out there with scary damage profiles that you can't really afford to ignore for most of the game. I feel like for Space Marine power lists like the Ironstorm Spearhead as well, the most efficient vehicle gun turrets around are going to see a lot of play soon, what with the massive support that detachment can bring. For this video comparing some Space Marine armour though, I thought we'd keep things quite focused and look at the numbers for just a few of the more common Space Marine armoured picks that are good at destroying enemy armour in their own right. For this one we're going to take a look at the Gladiator Lancer, Repulsor Executioner, Ballistus Dreadnought and Predator Annihilator, a fair few of which have had recent changes either in the balanced data slate or with the new leaked points cost for the Minotaur and Field Manual, which seems like it's probably going to be available to download sometime next week. The Gladiator Lancer is now 160 points after the balanced data slate, perhaps one of the most commonly played Space Marine vehicles provided you could actually find a kit for it that have been sold out for a while now. The Ballistus Dreadnought was initially a bit underwhelming at 170 points, but now it's down to 140, it competes far better. And the Repulsor Executioner is a solid all-round power choice I think, and then the new Field Manual points that dropped down from 230 to 220, definitely warranting it a second look I think. At the same time, the Oath of Moment nerf has meant that you can't reroll wound rolls with these. That might somewhat benefit the Gladiator Lancer, seeing as it already gets a built-in wound roll. Though admittedly it doesn't benefit from Oath of Moment as well as say the Predator Annihilator or Repulsor Executioner does. In any case, I thought we'd talk through the datasheets one by one and look how the numbers stack up against each other both in terms of damage output and defense against some armoured targets. First up, let's start with perhaps the one to beat in the Gladiator Lancer, a toughness 10, 12 wound gladiator tank with a 10-inch move, and this one's primary armament is the Lancer Laser Destroyer. 2 shots at strength 14, AP -4 and a huge damage d6 +3. Those shots are heavy, so if you can position yourself in a place where you don't have to move this turn, they'd be hitting it on a 2+, and it's also got some very fearsome built-in rerolls. You get to reroll 1 hit roll, wound roll and damage roll when you're making your attacks each turn due to its Aquilon optics. Means that quite a lot of the time you'll be wounding the enemy twice with that fearsome profile, a good chance to make them fail even if they have good invulnerable saves. And the tank does have a fair amount of secondary weapon systems as well. 7 strength 4 shots out to 24-inch range between some storm bolters and a stubber, and an Icarus pod for a little bit of mid-strength fire. For comparison, I thought it would be worth weighting the damage output to the same points cost as the Gladiator Lancer at 160 points, so we can see how they stack up against the others. These are the numbers that you can expect out of one Gladiator Lancer, averaging around about 1 Terminator target dead in a turn, a fairly mighty around about 11 or so wounds to a Rhino tank, 9 wounds to a Space Marine Land Raider with toughness 12 and a 2+ save, a pretty ideal target for it there. And I thought just for a unit that's got a good invulnerable save, I'd also throw in a Tyranid Maleceptor, toughness 11 and a 4+ invulnerable save, just perhaps to highlight a few of these that might be a little bit better against things that make the AP matter a bit less. I'd say that perhaps the Laser Destroyer ones are going to suffer the most against things with really good invulnerable saves. They've got great AP, so a lot of their damage output comes from that. It does also mean that the opponent's got a good chance to command point reroll an invulnerable save and have a potentially very good return on that investment as well, potentially saving them on average 6 or 7 damage. The Lancer does have some small arms as well, though I'd say it's probably less flexible than the Ballistus or the Repulsor Executioner if you did need to target some hordes. Just for sake of comparison with the others, I thought I'd make a few assumptions with the shooting. It's going to be an average for 3 rounds of shooting for things with hunter-killer missiles at 24-inch range, and just because some of them vary quite heavily depending on target or whether they're moving or not, I'm going to assume that you can remain stationary 1/3 of the time. Often in 40k you just need to move to get line of sight, and most of the targets will be shot at something that's greater than half strength. I haven't included cover in these ones, so that will make these numbers a little bit worse against the higher armor save targets, perhaps more so for the things that don't have as much AP as the Lancer. First into the ring in comparison, we've got the Repulsor Executioner. This guy's 220 points, so a much bigger tank with a toughness of 12 and 16 wounds. And for this comparison at least, we'll use the Heavy Laser Destroyer for it, where it's got 2 shots at strength 16, AP 4 and damage d6 +4 here. Slightly beefier stats, but in reality the main gun is usually going to hit a little bit less hard than the Gladiator Lancer's version, just because it's lacking those rather godly rerolls. Otherwise though, the Repulsor Executioner comes with a lot more additional guns. It's got a defensive array and 2 stobbers for 16 shots out to 24-inch range, a twin heavy bolter and an Icarus pod for some mid-strength firepower, plus also a heavy onslaught Gatling cannon for some devastating wound goodness, so certainly will be able to clear out a whole bunch of enemy chaff as well as taking out hard targets. Otherwise, it does have a transport capacity, which could be interesting for getting some Space Marines to the front in a Firestorm force, though its special rule is maybe a little bit more underwhelming, a +1 to hit against enemies below half strength. Definitely not unhelpful, but kind of overlaps with its heavy keyword. I feel like in general in 40k you're more odds on to be targeting something above half strength than below. Running the numbers and assuming that you're firing all the same guns at the primary target, the Repulsor Executioner outperforms a little bit against Terminators, all of these weighted to the 160 points like the Gladiator Lancer. The Repulsor Executioner does better against infantry, but then does a little bit worse against anything that doesn't have a really big invulnerable save, only getting 8 wounds per 160 points against the Rhino, or around about 6 or 7 versus the Land Raider versus the Lancers around 9. Kind of similar numbers against the high invulnerable save threat though. I guess a whole bunch of volume fire and a few devastating wounds helps narrow the gap there. In general, I think that the Lancer has slightly more impressive overall offensive stats, though in reality it's going to make more sense to fire a lot of the lighter guns at any infantry targets if they're available, rather than just ploughing them into the same tank. And the Repulsor Executioner maybe does have an advantage over some of the others in that it's a really big vehicle all in one big mass, very efficient for things like Tech Marines making all those guns hit on a 2+, or any focal stratagems that just target one vehicle for a boost. Perhaps the sustained hits on a 5+1 from the Ironstorm Spearhead. Next up, we've got the Leviathan box missiles and Las Dreadnought in the Ballistus. I thought at his initial 170 points he just wasn't really all that good for his role and compared badly against most other options, but Games Workshop have now repeatedly slashed the price for him. From the points from the upcoming Munitor and Field Manual 1.4, he's going to be 140 apparently. He's a tiny bit slower than the two that we've seen so far at only 8-inch movement, but it's not really all that far behind. It's got good durability with a 2+ save, as we'll see in the comparison later, very nice at toughness 10 and 12 wounds. And then for his main weapons, he strikes with Ballistus las cannons, 2 standard las cannon shots there, and then 2 missile launchers that strike at strength 10 and damage d6 if he's firing against vehicles, but you can swap it out for 2d6 frag shots if that makes more sense. I think the crack shots are generally going to be higher value most of the time if you can use them, but if you're firing against hordes then that's going to be the worst choice. The Ballistus special rule is that each time he makes a ranged attack against a unit that's not below half strength, you get to re-roll the hit roll. I think that's definitely better than units that are below half strength like the Repulsor Executioner. Under normal circumstances, and definitely towards the start of the game, that's going to be most of the time. Though it does mean that Oath of Moment won't really do anything good for him in that case. Throwing his numbers into the ring against these hard targets, the Ballistus Dreadnought does best against the Terminator profile. I guess as it goes, it's not a bad target for the missile launcher, wounding on 2s and putting them onto their invulnerable save. It's kind of similar to the Repulsor Executioner against light vehicles, that lags behind for the cost really quite significantly against the Maleceptor and Land Raider. That's due to the missiles wounding on a 5+, and also their slightly lower AP against the Land Raider. It means that while he keeps up against targets like Toughness 9 and Toughness 10, and should be at least fairly good against infantry with the frag profile, he's not going to be anywhere near as good as a dedicated tank cracker compared with the Repulsor and Lancer. Finally, for the main comparison, we've got the Predator Annihilator. This one's holding steady at 130 points, a profile that really quite a lot of armies have got access to. It's a toughness 10 tank with 1 wound less than the Gladiators at just 11 wounds, and then typically it's going to be armed with 3 las cannons and a hunter killer missile. 2 of the las cannons are fairly standard, one of them is strength 14 and gets twin linked for the turret one, and its special rule is to allow you to reroll damage rolls of 1 against monsters and vehicles. A little bit situational, but definitely adds some reliability and might save you a command point reroll from time to time. For comparison here, I chose to use 3 rounds of shooting as the basis for comparing the hunter killer missile in. Obviously you'll only get that on 1, but it does mean that you get to front load damage a little bit and get it in early in the game, which doesn't tend to be a bad thing at least. Overall, when comparing these to the other numbers, I just feel like they're kind of fine in every category, though not standout. Definitely on the lower end of the spectrum against the Terminators and Rhinos, kind of joint last with the lower ones, and then moving up into 3rd position against the Maleceptor and Land Raider, beating out the Ballistus due to wounding those targets better than the Ballistus does. Still seems it's behind the Repulsor Executioner though. Overall, perhaps the least impressive out of the whole bunch, though I would say that maybe out of any of these it has the most use for the Oath of Moment buff. It doesn't have any special rules that either improve the hit roll or allow you to re-roll natively, which means that you should get the full effect from Oath of Moment as opposed to a kind of partial boost from it. Damage is only one side of the story realistically though. I'd say it's maybe the slightly more important stat with these long-range tank killing units, but it's definitely not like durability doesn't matter a bit as well. Here are just some of the numbers for how the 4 units survive against a few things that you might have pointed against your tanks. An overcharged plasma shot at strength 8, AP 3 and damage 2, a mid-strength anti-tank profile with strength 10, AP 2 and damage D6, say like the Ballistus' missile launcher, and then a trusty strength 12, AP 3 and damage D6 plus 1 las cannon. These are weighted to 160 points worth of unit once more just for comparison, and these represent the hits needed to kill that many points worth of each one of these vehicles. Overall and fairly obviously, it's just pretty much a straight win for the Ballistus Dreadnought here. Its 2+ armor save means that it is slightly the best in all categories against all of these attacks, perhaps particularly so against the overcharged plasma versus the Lancer and Repulsor Executioner. It is basically just flat more durable than the Lancer, having a better save and the same profile and also costing less points as well. And against anything that doesn't actually care about the toughness differential for the Repulsor Executioner, it's also going to do well. The Predator Annihilator is also significantly more durable for the cost than the Repulsor or the Lancer against mid-strength fire. Otherwise though, against the slightly more dedicated anti-tank weapons, it seems to be the Ballistus Dreadnought followed fairly closely by the Repulsor Executioner with its big toughness, with the Predator coming into 3rd place. Pretty good news for the Ballistus overall, and I'd argue that perhaps the 2+ save is actually even better than this table might imply against a whole bunch of attacks. Cover saves are really quite easy to get in 10th edition, and in general the 2+ armor saves tend to benefit the most from those. And then on top of that you also have the option of using Armor of Contempt as well. It means that you could be saving things like las cannons on a 3+ quite easily. A massive step up on the 4+ that the others would manage under similar circumstances. So overall, between the two, I feel like Games Workshop has actually done fairly well to balance most of these Space Marine tanks that kill tanks. My favourite 3 based on these numbers would be the Gladiator Lancer, Ballistus Dreadnought and the Repulsor Executioner. I feel like there's definitely room in the army for any or a mix of those ones, depending on what exactly it is that you need. The Lancer still very much seems to be the king of tank busting anti-armor damage, particularly against higher toughness values, but it does come with its downsides. It is a little bit less flexible against hordes than the others, and it does seem to have the worst durability of the lot per point. The Ballistus I think is interesting. It's pretty good against light to mid vehicles and against Terminators, though it won't be as solid against the absolute toughest stuff, though it does come with some pretty standout durability amongst the rest of them. And the Repulsor Executioner, as well as being an enormous tank for stratagem and tech marine type synergy, just has strong all-round damage and defense, a little bit of potentially useful transport, and the best numbers out of any of them when it comes to dealing with hordes if you need to, if you're matched up against them, or it's just situational. Unfortunately, based on these, I would say that the Predator Annihilator is the one that falls short without really too much to sell it in my opinion. I'm not sure the damage increase versus the Ballistus is really quite enough to justify it. Its defensive numbers aren't particularly impressive, and it is definitely the least flexible out of any of them. It won't be able to flex to deal with mass infantry if it's desperately needed in a pinch. As always, look forward to hearing your thoughts though. If you had to go with just one of these Space Marine tank profiles to deal with enemy armour, which would it be and why? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, while I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. And finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.